then these individuals who are already tapped into the grid can really struggle with their experience of being here. Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to Going Dotty. In today's video we're going to do a little bit of a spirituality 101, looking into what it is that we're moving through and why it can be beneficial to us in our life. So let's crack into it. So when we're talking about spirituality, by the dictionary definition, we're talking about the element of things that is related to our spirit or our soul in nature, as opposed to materialism and what is physicalized within form. And I suppose what that means on a more pragmatic level, on a day-to-day living element of that, is that, while we're here, we have physical bodies and we certainly look and appear to be very physical to each other. Our actual experience of life itself can be said to be spiritual in its nature. I think we can really make the argument for the conceptual consideration that to a certain extent our thoughts are a spiritual experience, insofar as they manifest biologically within the body. That is not being disputed, but rather the experience of having thoughts, the experience of having emotions, the experience of relationships, this intangible thing that is certainly real, but how do we physically manifest that in the sense of the quantifiable form, the material nature and level of its form? And this is, I think, becoming a very pertinent way to look at life and look at the world. There's that, which is, and that which we are in, but then there is also that essence, that non-physical essence of that which we are. And when we're looking at that layer of life and self, we're looking at, I suggest, our consciousness, our conscious form, our conscious being, our soul, if you are comfortable with that word, but our spiritual essence, that which we experience and therefore is real, and yet, you can't weigh it on a measuring scale. You can't, it doesn't weigh grams and ounces. It's something more ethereal than that. And if we don't have an avenue or a structure to be able to consider this non-physical element of life, then so much of life that happens, and life happens through this mental perception, this mental filter of our perception, our thoughts, what's going on, what's happening. And if we don't have a medium through which to, or a lens through which to understand these things, life can really get very overwhelming. When we're talking about spirituality, I also think that we're talking about conscious awareness, personal development, self-awareness, becoming lucid, coming into lucidity, coming into our own awareness of our own being. We become spatially aware in a different way than we were before. And it very much is this process of moving from one room of the mind, one layer of self and one type of experience into another. And this is often the spiritual journey or the awakening process, if that's a term that you've heard about before, you might be familiar with. And it's very unfortunate, really, that this term makes it seem like you're either in it or you're not in it. It's like a club, and you're either part of that club or you're not part of that club. And I think that distinction and that barrier, it's very really there, and it obviously does cause a problem. It is problematic because it makes people feel like it's non-inclusive. And yet, in the same breath, we have to acknowledge that we have to experience something in order to have a frame reference of what is going on and what is being spoken about, what is everybody going on about. And once you have a touchstone and an entrance into that, then it fulfills your awareness. You're like, oh, I get it. You have this epiphany moment, or you have this aha moment. And I just like to highlight that because I think it's something that comes up a lot. I think there can often be a divisive nature within the industry, people who are, conscious or people who are unconscious. And I think that this is part of a much wider narrative of our times. I do cover this concept off in another video when I talk about our mental health and what mental health is and how mental health is manifesting, on planet at the moment between these presumably two camps of people who are, aware or becoming aware or having to be aware, or those who are unaware, unconscious, unawake, in the living dream. And this occurring under the umbrella term of the illusion, or, the rule of the Maya, the rule of the mainstream, where there is only one narrative and everybody is subtly and subconsciously encouraged by the collective to fulfill this one narrative instead of allowing every individual to be themselves in a healthy, integrated manner. So we will cover that off in another video, but when it comes to spirituality itself, I would like to suggest that there's a few reasons why people are brought into spirituality. Some people just feel the trigger. Something has happened within them. They feel, like they have been triggered into their own lucidity. Something occurs within their time-space vehicle and they suddenly become more aware of a layer and a level of life than they were previously aware of before. And therefore the search begins, because there is this essence or this taste of an experience. And when an individual, when their intuitive system, when their energy body naturally evolves, it would make sense that the human living within the larger energetic system of the being that a person is, like what we all are, is something larger than us and we live through that. But that's more of a philosophical concept for perhaps another video. But people become lucid. They start to awaken into their own lucidity, and without having a structure yet of what it is that they are becoming lucid to, and therefore how to operate themselves within that realm, it's it can be either or. It can be very exciting, very positive, but it can also be very difficult. People then step into what would be known as the spiritual journey or the spiritual path, and there's the tumultuous nature of that, the highs and lows, the pros and cons, the gifts that you unveil within the self from doing the work, but then the sheer human mental workload and effort that goes into that. So I just want to try and highlight, what the spiritual journey truly seems to be manifesting as and for within people in the Western world. And I suppose when we consider the larger social context of the fact that our society, our modern Western society, but even the roots of our society going back a couple of thousand years, we don't really have this as a system. And that becomes important because this isn't like living code within our DNA. It's not like our recent ancestors lived like this and we've just been tapped out of it. So I think that's an interesting element to bring into the equation. This isn't natural to us. We have been bred out of this way of thinking, this way of being. And I suggest within the Western world, that's why a lot of this is very uncomfortable. Some people are brought into this because it's a natural expression of themselves, their essence, and their natural movement of life. So that would be another reason why people step into the spiritual path, because they've always intuitively felt something, and then something comes along, maybe it's a course, maybe it's a class, maybe they come across something, and then all of a sudden this access point into spirituality becomes something very important to them. Somewhat similar to this, we can say that some people are just naturally tapped into this part of themselves anyways. Whether they're born like this, they haven't really tried, they haven't had to do anything. It's more like their energetic, spiritual element is already turned on, is already lucid. And I think what we find here is a lot of individuals who are really struggling to cope within the world as the world is, because they're already living on a slightly higher level of awareness. But if we are living in a higher level of awareness innately, in a world that isn't grounded in a better basic form of awareness, which is something I think we can objectively observe about the world at this time, to put it mildly, then these individuals who are already tapped into the grid can really struggle with their experience of being here. And I would suggest as well that for a lot of these people, following a set spiritual path or a spiritual discipline, a practice of being in their life and world, isn't so easy for these individuals, because the desire of mastering this element that comes into self isn't quite there if an individual has already always been tapped into this kind of stuff. And then finally, as I perceive it, the last reason or the final reason that a lot of people come into this way of being or take this on within their life and their world is quite simply because they have to. A trauma can occur mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and people find themselves having to look outside of the predefined box that is, showcased and offered by society, culture, and our mainstream structure. And people find themselves needing answers beyond that which is readily available to the masses or in a mainstream sort of sense. So these are really the 4 reasons that I generally find that people enter into the spiritual journey, or the sorts of people who you would find within the spiritual path quite naturally in any ways.